Some of the back and forth this week over the federal government's fall economic update. It was a slimmer document than years past, with some new money for affordable housing that Ottawa won't start doling out, though, until 2025. Despite the relatively pared down update, the deficit is projected to keep going up next year, and debt servicing costs, thanks to that deficit, plus higher interest rates, will hit $60 billion a year by 2028. Let's bring back the front bench to talk about all of that. Former BC Premier Christy Clark, CTV News political analyst, and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair, and the Toronto Star's Stephanie Levitz. Christy, I'll start with you on this one. Did you think, we had talked about how the government was signaling it was going to be pared down. It certainly was not a mini budget like it has been in the past number of years. Do you think that was a smart strategic move for them or not?
Yes, I do. I think that they are going to, I think it signals that they're saving the good stuff for potentially an election campaign or some future time. They know that you don't get a lot of juice out of announcements kind of mid-budget. I do think, though, the numbers are really shocking. The interest, just the interest on the debt going up $60 billion. That is a lot of money. That's more money than many of the total provincial budgets in Canada. And, it's really, for me, an example of the chickens coming home to roost finally. When governments are fast and loose with other people's money for a long time, you spend a lot of it, you make a lot of good announcements, people kind of like that, but then the bill finally comes due. And the problem in government is that the delay between those two things is so long. I think out of this mini budget, there's not a lot to cheer about, although I think the housing stuff in it could be good. It will very much depend, though, on whether or not the federal government is able to deliver. And we've certainly seen them a little long on announcements and short on delivery in the past.
Even the money, though, Tom, with which they would use to deliver on those announcements doesn't become available to 2025. There are other housing announcements going on through the Accelerator Fund primarily, but a lot of those even are for tens of thousands of units, maybe all in all hundreds of thousands of units, but they won't be built for years down the road. And they pale in comparison to what the CMHC estimates needs to be built at 3.5 million additional units by 2030 to restore affordability. What does that do to, as the phrase I used earlier, like the political punch this lands for them?
I think that the Liberals landed a pretty darn good political punch because it was concentrated in one place. We're so used to them. You can just imagine a room full of chiefs of staff saying, don't forget my budget part, don't forget my ministry, don't forget me. And so they always had this scattershot approach, and there was never any theme. There was never anything you could actually identify. What I took away was a half a dozen or so things where they were answering the criticisms of Poilievre and the Conservatives. Now, that's a feather in Poilievre's cap, because he's been calling the tune and now Trudeau's dancing to it. But Trudeau is using things to get to a result on housing, spending a lot of money, on groceries. You can't just talk about groceries. He's looking at what's in the toolbox for the federal government. Well, we're in charge of combines legislation. We can go after anti-competition practices. We only have a handful of large grocery chains. We might even threaten to break them up. Let's start going after them. They went after the banks, and nothing major or nothing really that new, but they called it a charter of rights for the people who are renewing their mortgages. They're going to be glad to see that. So this is Trudeau using tools of public administration and policy that exist because it's Ottawa's jurisdiction, and Poilievre's laissez-faire freedom approach. Oh, the government shouldn't be doing anything. So he can't keep complaining about the cost of groceries and then tell Trudeau, don't interfere with the grocery chains. He can't complain about the cost of mortgages and then tell Trudeau, don't interfere with the banks, it's the free market. So Trudeau's picking and choosing his spots. He's planting a garden here. And I can see some of this stuff coming to fruition for Trudeau. It's going to be a process. He's got to dismantle some of the arguments that go all the way back to when Poilievre invented the term that really started to stick, which was just inflation. So Trudeau's answering that bit by bit. And by the way, the minister we saw stand up there, Sean Fraser, one of the most effective politicians of his generation. And I have to say one thing about this guy that amazes me. His first press conference was a disaster because he didn't really realize that because he didn't speak French, he had to have somebody with him who could, and it didn't go very well. This guy has dogged determination. His French today, I would qualify without hesitation as fluently bilingual. It's quite a feat.
Just to pick up on what Tom was saying there, I thought, in particular, let's take the charter, the mortgage charter, signified something different than we've seen in the past 6 months from the Liberals, which is actually looking ahead to what their next political problem might be, instead of reacting to the one that Poilievre has defined kind of better than any of their opponents or anyone in their own government. Do you see that as emblematic in this document at all?
Yeah, that is exactly what leapt out at me for exactly that reason, Vassy, was this mortgage charter. Because one of the arguments that the Poilievre Conservatives have begun to start talking about or begun advancing is what's going to happen to thousands of Canadians whose mortgages are up for renewal in the next couple of years. They took out a mortgage at the low bottom, basically free money in the pandemic. Now they're going to renew. If interest rates stay high, they're going to be hit with a massive increase in their mortgage payments. They're going to freak out. The economy could suffer. Watching the Liberals try to get ahead of that in a way, like in terms of public education, this is not an enforceable charter. It's not forcing the banks to do anything at all. But it does, I think a lot of folks, like, among us, people I know who know homes, were like, oh, I didn't realize this and I didn't realize that. And so trying to encourage Canadians to empower themselves. And in a funny way, it's that in and of itself is a conservative argument, right? Is not waiting for the government or the banks to do it, for people to take the education, own their own mortgages, own their rights, and act for them. I found that interesting. I also found some of the smaller things that didn't have big money attached. Tom alluded to the Competition Act changes. Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister, talked about going after junk fees, little things that are sort of irritants for Canadians that get in the way of life. And you look at them and go, why am I paying this, for God's good sakes? And tackling those little bits and pieces of people's everyday lives in the now, knowing that some of the money for housing, some of the money, on the clean investment stuff, that's decades-long investment. That's not the now. People are still looking for that little what's in this for me today bit, and they delivered a few of those too.
Do you think
Vassy, housing has become the number one issue for people?
Yeah, go ahead.
And people are looking at their kids and saying they're not getting married, they're not having grandkids, they will never have a realistic chance to own a home. I don't think what the federal government says about what they're going to do actually makes much difference anymore, because they've been talking about it for a long time. Next election rolls around, if they haven't made real strides in getting more housing built, they are going to pay a price.
Let me just follow up with you on that, because I sort of had mentioned it to Tom, right? What they did promise in this budget was loans for the construction of rental housing. Those loans aren't even available till 2025. They have made a series of other announcements, particularly in the last few months, but they amount to hundreds of thousands of units over, I should say, the next 3 to 7 to 10 years, right? Nothing of that is immediate. Does that dilute the potential impact politically that looking present on the housing file for the first time in a long time actually would have for them?
Well, the Prime Minister has gained a well-earned reputation for virtue signaling, for saying things and talking a good talk, and he really is probably one of the world's best at that. But I think that over time, people become a little cynical about it when they hear the talk and they don't see the outcome. And, that can happen with a lot of stuff, but I just think that this housing issue is such a real, very real day-to-day problem and an overarching worry in so many people's lives. I don't think people are going to let this one slide if they have to wait until 2025 to start seeing holes in the ground.
Their their advisor on housing at the cabinet retreat, Mike Moffat, who used to be an economic advisor, Tom, to the Prime Minister. I did an interview today with him for our radio program, and his litmus test for this was, if I'm 28 years old looking at this document and I can't afford a home, is there anything in there when I wake up the next morning that makes me kind of feel better about my chances? And his conclusion was no, barely, and so he gave the document a C-. Do you think that the housing crisis will ultimately plague the federal Liberals going ahead?
Oh, it's already plaguing them. And since they've always talked a good game, to stay with Christie's theme about sustainable development, the essence of sustainable development is intergenerational equity, fairness between generations. And this is the first generation of Canadians who have less chance than their parents to own a home. That's never happened before in the history of our country. And it's because we're not good at planning. And you don't have to be a Soviet central planner with a 5-year plan to understand that if you let in 1.2 million new Canadians, and I'm all in favor of opening up Canada. That's how we built this great country, is with immigration. There's no argument there. But last year, we let in the equivalent of the population of Saskatchewan. And you can't bring in a new Saskatchewan every year unless there's a little bit of planning about education, about health, about social services, and yes, about housing. And that number doesn't include the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of foreign students who come in. Welcome to Canada. A lot of them will decide to stay here and apply for citizenship. Great way for the country to get fantastic talent. what are they doing? I was just talking to some people in Nova Scotia who were explaining to me that students who were traveling hours to find a place to live, to get back to their universities, to continue studying, especially foreign students. And how did we get ourselves in behind this 8 ball? It's because we haven't been good at managing the details of public administration in Ottawa. We've hired a whole bunch of new civil servants. It's costing a fortune, but we don't have much to show for it. That's, I think, the Achilles heel of the Trudeau Liberals, frankly.
I have just less than 30 seconds. Last word to you, Steph.
The challenge with this document, right, is that the government is at the end of its life cycle. And so at some point, I think as we've talked about here, they really did need to leave some stuff for budget 2024, but also have something to say now and lay some of that fiscal groundwork for budget 2024, which will probably, in good chances, be an election budget.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll conclude on that point. Thanks so much to our front bench. I appreciate the discussion.